The road had no name on any map he'd ever seen, just a pale scar of packed dirt running west through scrublands so dry it seemed to have forgotten what rain felt like. He drove it most mornings because it was the shortest way back from the feed store in town, and because it asked nothing of him. No traffic, no neighbors waving from the fence, no one needing a word from a man who'd grown careful with words over the years. Just flat land, pale sky, and the creak of his old truck finding every groove in the hardpan. He was 63 that summer, though he moved like a man who carried a few years extra. One knee had been bad since before he could remember why, and his left shoulder pulled if he reached too high or too fast. He wore the same thing he wore most days: faded denim over a gray cotton shirt, boots that had been resoled twice and were asking for a third time. His hat was the color of old straw. The truck was a 1978 Ford, rust along the lower doors, a crack in the passenger mirror that split every reflection into two slightly wrong versions of the same thing. The farm behind him was 42 acres of increasingly difficult ground. The aquifer had been dropping for 2 summers running, the well pump working harder every week for less water, and the county had seen no meaningful rain since April. He grew what he could: a kitchen garden, a small orchard he'd been nursing back from near death, a few rows of field corn that were surviving rather than thriving. He'd sold off his beef cattle 3 years back when feed costs climbed past what the calves would return. He was down to chickens, a pair of aging pigs, and stubbornness. He hadn't planned on stopping that morning. He'd rounded the long bend where the road dipped between 2 low ridges when he saw it. A wooden crate sitting at the road's edge, busted on one side, part of the slat wall caved inward. It was the kind of crate a poultry hauler might stack 3 high on a flatbed. It was also sitting in direct sun in July, at 9 in the morning, when the temperature was already climbing past 90. He slowed without deciding to. That was instinct, not thought. He heard it before he opened the door, a thin, urgent sound, high and fast and desperate. Not one voice, but several, layered on top of each other in that way small creatures communicate when they are trying to make themselves large. He stepped out of the cab and stood in the road for a moment, listening, not rushing. The crate had been left behind. That much was clear. The truck that carried it was long gone, no tire tracks turning back, no sign of anyone who might return. Whatever was inside had been moving, probably for a while, in heat that showed no mercy. He walked toward it slowly, the way you approach anything that is frightened. He knelt down in the dust and looked inside. There she was. A goose, full grown, white with a gray smudge across the back of her neck, pressed flat against the far corner of the crate. Her wings were half spread, not to fly. There was nowhere to fly, but to cover what was beneath her. She had turned herself into a shelter. Under her chest and under the loose drape of those wings, he could see movement: small heads, bright eyes, a cluster of goslings packed together so tightly they looked like a single breathing thing. He did not count them yet. He just looked. The mother held his gaze. She was not wild in the way a frightened animal goes frantic. She was past frantic. She had done everything she could do, and now she was simply enduring. Her eyes were steady and exhausted in the way eyes get when an animal has made a decision to stay until the end. She was not going to run. She was not going to leave them. She had planted herself over those goslings, and that was where she was going to be found, whatever found her. He had seen that look before, not in animals. He recognized it anyway. He sat back on his heels in the dust for a moment and studied the situation, the way he had learned to study things, quietly, without jumping ahead. The crate was heavy enough that it had not blown over, but busted enough that it offered almost no shade at this angle of sun. The slat that had caved in was on the west side, which told him the crate had been dropped from height rather than set down. Fallen off a tailgate, maybe, or slid from a stack when a truck took the corner too fast. He had seen that happen with livestock crates on county roads. Sometimes the driver noticed. Sometimes they did not, or did not want to go back. There were no markings on the crate to say who owned them or where they were headed. Just raw wood, a few staples, a wire latch that had bent open in the fall. He pulled off his work gloves and put them in his back pocket. Then he reached for the plastic water bottle on his belt. The old kind with a twist cap, army green, the paint worn off around the middle from years of daily use. He unscrewed the cap and thought for a moment. He had no dish. He had no bowl. He looked at his own hands, the broad, dry palms of a man who had spent decades working soil, and he cupped them together and poured a careful measure of water into the hollow he made. He lowered his hands slowly toward the crate, through the broken slat, setting them down gently on the floor of the crate like an offering. He did not move. He did not speak. He waited. The goslings were the first to come. Of course they were. They were small enough to be fearless in the way only the very young manage. One beak found the water, and then another, and then they all came at once, pressing in, drinking fast. The mother watched his hands the whole time, and she did not move away. He stayed like that for longer than he expected. His knees were hurting. They always hurt on hard ground, on dry ground especially. Something about the heat drawing the old damage tighter. But he did not shift his weight or change his position. He had learned a long time ago that trust was a thing you had to hold still for. You could not rush it, and you could not pretend. Animals and people both knew the difference, and the mother bird watching him from the back of that crate was not going to be fooled by any performance of patience. She wanted the real thing, so he gave her the real thing. When the goslings had drunk what was in his hands, he poured again, slow and careful, tilting the bottle just enough. A little spilled over his wrist and soaked into the dust below the crate and was gone before it had traveled an inch. That was the kind of country this was, the kind that took everything the sky offered and asked for more. He understood that. He had farmed ground not much different from this, ground that punished waste and rewarded nothing but stubbornness. The mother goose drank last. She came forward only after the goslings had pulled back a little, satisfied, and when her beak touched his palm, he felt the small, rough scrape of it and stayed absolutely still. She was not gentle about it, but she was not afraid, and to him that was the same as trust. He sat back on his heels when she was done and looked at what he was dealing with. 7 goslings, 1 mother, a crate with a broken side panel, a latch that had snapped clean off, and a bottom slat that had cracked in two and shifted sideways, so the birds had been standing at a slight tilt the whole time. Somebody had loaded them into this crate or driven them somewhere and either couldn't stop or didn't bother to. That was the whole story, as far as he could read it. He had heard stories like it before, told in different words, set in different places. It was always the same story. He looked up and down the road, nothing moving in either direction. The heat made the asphalt ripple at a distance, the kind of shimmer that turned air into water if you were desperate enough to believe it. He was not desperate, but the birds had been, were still. The water had helped, but it was not enough, and the crate was not shelter, not in this sun, not with these temperatures climbing the way they would by midday. He stood slowly, the way a man stands when he has made a decision he knows will cost him something. His truck was 40 feet behind him, engine ticking as the metal cooled. He walked back to it and opened the tailgate. There were feed sacks piled along one side and a coil of old fence wire and a spare tire he had been meaning to get properly mounted for about 6 months. He moved the sacks to one corner and looked at the space he had made. It was enough. He walked back to the crate. The mother goose watched him the whole way, her neck low, her body settled protectively over the goslings. She had stopped hissing. That was something. She was still wary, the way any creature is wary of a hand that has not yet proved itself a second time. But the hissing had stopped, and her eyes tracked him with something closer to waiting than to fear. He crouched beside the crate and studied the latch. It was a simple wire loop, twisted shut, the kind of closure a man uses when he trusts the road not to shake things loose. The road had not cooperated. He untwisted it carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The way he had learned to move around animals that had been frightened badly enough to forget their own good judgment. The latch gave. He folded the crate door open and stayed still. The mother goose did not bolt. She looked at the open door, looked at him, looked at the open door again. The goslings shuffled beneath her, and one small head appeared from under her wing, peering out at the world with the wide, uncomplicated curiosity that very young things have before they learn what curiosity can cost. He did not reach in. He waited. His knees were telling him what they thought of crouching on hot asphalt. But he ignored that the way he had learned to ignore most things his body complained about. She came out on her own terms. One slow step, then another, her feet gripping the edge of the crate with careful precision. The goslings followed in a loose cluster, tumbling slightly, righting themselves, staying close to her sides. He counted them as they moved. 6. All 6 still moving, still responsive, their eyes bright even if their legs were unsteady from the heat and the confinement. He stood slowly and went to the truck cab. He pulled a clean feed sack from behind the seat, shook it out, and laid it flat in the bed of the truck where he had cleared the space. Then he came back and did the only thing he could think to do, which was crouch again and wait, and trust that the mother would understand that the shade of the truck bed was better than the open road. It took a few minutes. She investigated the rear wheel. She walked a short circle around the back bumper. One gosling wandered toward the ditch, and she redirected it with a nudge of her bill. But eventually she stepped up onto the tailgate, which he had lowered flat, and walked into the bed and stood on the feed sack. The goslings followed her up, all 6 of them, in the stumbling way that young things climb things not meant for them. He raised the tailgate gently, latched it, and stood there a moment with his hands resting on the hot metal. He did not know what he was going to do with them. He had not thought that far ahead. He only knew what he was not going to do, which was leave them here, and for now that was enough of a plan to drive on. He drove slowly the rest of the way home, taking the ruts in the county road at half his usual speed, steering around the worst of the washboards the way he used to steer around things that could not be undone. Every few minutes he checked the mirror, and he could see the mother standing in the truck bed, with her neck low and her body spread wide over the goslings, the way a tent covers what it needs to cover. She had stopped panicking. She had made her decision, and now she was doing the only thing a mother can do after a decision is made, which is hold still and keep what she has close. He pulled through the gate and around the side of the barn and stopped in the shade of the big cottonwood. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. He looked out at the yard. The water trough by the old sheep pen had gone dry in the drought, but the structure of the pen was still solid, the wire still good, the gate still hung right. He had not used it in 2 years. He had meant to take it down and never gotten around to it, and now he was glad about the things he had never gotten around to. He got out, filled a bucket from the spigot at the barn wall, and carried it to the old pen. He set it inside. Then he went back to the truck, lowered the tailgate, and stepped back. The mother put her head over the edge and looked at the yard for a long time. She looked at the barn. She looked at the cottonwood. She looked at the pen. Then she stepped off the tailgate and walked straight to the pen gate as if she had been here before and was only returning. He watched them settle. The goslings drank from the bucket in that urgent, grateful way that young things drink when they have been without for too long. The mother drank too, slowly, with pauses in between the way animals drink when they are finally somewhere safe. He did not have a plan for what came next. He had no experience with geese. He had kept chickens years ago when his wife was still alive, and he knew how to read a hen. But a goose was its own kind of creature with its own kind of stubbornness and its own kind of intelligence, and he respected that without pretending to understand it. He figured he would put out grain, keep the bucket full, patch the one corner of the pen where the wire had a sag, and learn what he needed to learn. What he did not figure on, what he had no way of knowing that afternoon while he stood in the cottonwood shade, watching 6 goslings press against their mother in the corner of an old sheep pen, was that the geese would stay not just through the summer, but through everything the summer was going to bring. And what the summer was going to bring was the kind of trouble that does not announce itself until it is already standing in your doorway. The trouble came in the form of a letter, the kind that arrives in a plain envelope with a county return address and sits on the kitchen table for 2 days before a man can make himself open it. He had been behind on the land note for longer than he liked to admit. There had been a string of bad seasons, a year when the hay yield dropped to almost nothing, another year when an equipment repair took money he had meant to put toward the payment. He had talked to the bank once, a brief and uncomfortable conversation with a younger man in a clean shirt who used words like restructuring and assessed value in a tone that made the veteran feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. He had left that office with a handshake that meant nothing and a vague sense that he had just been told something polite that covered something much harder. The letter confirmed the harder thing. He was being formally notified that if the balance was not addressed by a date now only a few months away, the property would move toward proceedings. The language was careful and official and bloodless, the way legal language always is, as if the words themselves had never touched anything living. He folded the letter and set it back on the table. He did not say anything out loud. He had never been a man who talked to empty rooms. He made himself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, at the dry grass, at the fence line that needed another post replaced, at the old barn with the paint going thin on the south side. He had put 30 years into this land. His wife was buried at the edge of the east field under a cottonwood that dropped yellow leaves every October. The idea of leaving was not an idea he could hold in his mind for more than a few seconds before it stopped making any sense at all. He went outside because that was what he did when things pressed on him. He walked the property the way he had always walked it, not for any particular reason, just to be in contact with it, to let his boots find the ground and remind him what was real. The geese were loose in the lower field. He had started letting them out each morning, and they had settled into a reliable pattern of moving together in a loose formation, feeding, resting, moving again. The goslings were not so small anymore. They had grown fast through the early weeks, and now they moved with a certain directness, a purposefulness that geese seem to carry with them the way some animals carry nervousness. The mother still led. She always led. He watched them from the fence for a while and felt something settle slightly in his chest, the way a man feels when he is in the presence of something that does not know about letters or banks or proceedings, something that is simply alive and going about the work of being alive. It helped. Not much, but a little. The next morning he rose before the light came fully and stood in the kitchen with his coffee going cold on the counter. He had not slept well. The kind of sleep a man gets when his mind will not agree to rest is worse sometimes than no sleep at all. You wake up feeling as though you have been somewhere unpleasant for hours, but cannot say where. He drank the coffee anyway and pulled on his boots and went out before the sun had cleared the ridge. The geese were already moving. He had not let them out yet. The gate to the lower field was still latched, but he could hear them through the barn wall, a low, steady sound. Not the alarm noise they made when something startled them, but something more deliberate. He unlatched the gate and they came through in their usual formation, the mother first, the others close behind, and they did not spread out the way they normally did in the early part of the morning. They moved with intention, angling south toward the dry corner of the lower field, where the soil had always been pale and cracked, and where almost nothing ever grew. He had noticed it before, not with any particular thought attached to it, just the way a man notices a pattern and files it somewhere without deciding what to do with it. They kept going back to that corner. The mother would stand there sometimes in the late afternoon with her head lowered, not feeding, not resting, just standing. He had assumed it was something he did not understand about geese, some habit or preference that belonged to them and not to him. But this morning she walked directly to that corner and stopped. The others gathered around her. They stood together in the pale dust and did not move. He walked out to where they were standing. The ground there was harder than it should have been, given how dry the season had been everywhere else. That was something he had not quite registered before. Everything else on the lower field had gone to powder in the drought, loose and fine under the boot. But here the ground had a different quality, firm, almost resistant. He pressed his heel into it, and it did not give the way the rest of the field gave. He stood there for a while. Then he went to the machine shed and found the long iron bar he used for breaking ground when the soil was stubborn. And he came back and drove it down into that corner. It went in harder than he expected for the first foot. Then something shifted in the resistance. Not softness exactly, but a change, a different kind of density, something that had moisture held somewhere inside it. He stood back and looked at the geese. They had not moved. The mother was watching him with that steady, sideways look she had, the same look she had given him from inside the broken crate on the road, the look of something that has been waiting for someone to finally pay attention. He went back to the shed for a shovel. He dug slowly at first, the way a careful man digs when he is not entirely sure what he is looking for, but trusts the instinct that told him to start. The shovel bit into the firm earth with more resistance than he had felt anywhere on the property in months. That resistance felt like information. Everything else on this farm had surrendered to the drought without much argument, cracking open or turning to dust. But this ground pushed back, and he had learned long ago to pay attention when something pushed back. The geese moved a few feet to the side to give him room, but they did not leave. The mother settled herself down into the dirt at the edge of his work and watched with the patient certainty of an animal that already knows the answer to a question the man is still asking. He got down 2 feet, and the soil changed color. Darker, not soaked, not wet, but carrying the memory of moisture the way old wood carries the smell of rain long after the storm is gone. He stopped and crouched and pressed his fingers into it. There was give there, a faint coolness. He sat back on his heels and let out a long breath he did not realize he had been holding. He kept digging. By the time the light had moved halfway across the afternoon sky, he was standing in a hole that came up past his knees, and the walls of it were showing him something that made him set the shovel down very carefully against the side of the hole and just stand still. The earth at the bottom had gone from dark to almost black. When he pressed the heel of his boot down on it, a thin film of water appeared around the edges of his sole. Not rushing, not pooling fast, just seeping up the way water does when it has been buried under pressure for a long time and has finally found a place to go. He stood in that hole for a long moment. Then he climbed out and sat down on the dry grass at the edge of it and put his forearms on his knees and looked at the small, dark square of disturbed earth where the water was slowly, quietly finding its way to the surface. The geese had gathered around him, not excitedly, not noisily, just present, the way they always were. The mother tucked herself against his boot the way she sometimes did in the mornings. He looked at her. She had led him here the same way she had led him to water before, except that time it had been his hand she was drinking from, and now it was the land's turn. He could not have explained to anyone who asked why he was certain this was the beginning of something, rather than the end. He simply was. He went to the house to find the phone number for the county well service. The county well service number was written in pencil on the back of an old feed store receipt he kept tucked into the kitchen drawer, with the rubber bands and the spare keys. He had put it there 2 summers ago when the main well started dropping, and he had thought about calling but decided to wait and see. He smoothed the receipt flat on the counter and looked at it for a moment before he dialed. The man who answered sounded young, distracted, like he was writing something else while he talked. The veteran described the location on his property, the depth he had dug by hand, the way the moisture had come up slowly through the clay. There was a pause on the other end. The young man said it might just be a seep. He said seeps were common in that kind of soil, especially after any rain came through, even light rain. He said it probably would not amount to much. He said the veteran could bring someone out to look at it, but that the survey fee alone would cost more than most dry holes were worth. The veteran said he understood. He said he would like someone to come out anyway. There was another pause. The young man put him on hold for a moment, then came back and gave him a date 2 weeks out. The veteran thanked him, wrote the date on the corner of a paper bag with a ballpoint pen, and hung up. 2 weeks was fine. He had waited longer for things that mattered less. He went back out to the hole in the morning and found it had filled another inch overnight. The water was still murky with disturbed clay, but it was there, sitting in the bottom of the square he had dug, reflecting a small square of pale morning sky back up at him. He crouched and touched it with his fingers. Cold. Colder than surface water had any right to be in that heat. That meant depth. That meant pressure from somewhere below that was pushing it up rather than letting it collect from above. He did not say anything out loud, but something in his chest settled that had been tight for longer than he wanted to admit. The geese were out in the field when he walked back. The goslings, nearly full-grown now, moved in their loose, unhurried way through the dry grass, the mother drifting between them with the calm authority she had always carried. He watched them for a while from the fence. They had led him here without knowing what they were doing, and without needing to know. They had simply followed what their instincts told them was true, the same way he had followed what his told him the morning he pulled the crate off that back road and heard the small voices inside it asking for something. He went to get his tools and begin clearing the area properly before the survey crew arrived. The survey crew came out 2 days later in a white truck with county markings on the door. 2 men with equipment he did not recognize, clipboards, and the practiced efficiency of people who had seen a lot of land and formed quick opinions about most of it. They walked the corner of the field while he stood back and let them work. One of them crouched where he had crouched, pressed a measuring rod into the softened earth, and said something to the other in a low voice. They took readings for the better part of an hour. When they finished, the older of the 2 walked over to him and said that what he had was a natural spring, fed by a fractured aquifer running below the rock shelf at the property's western edge. Not a large one, but consistent. The kind that did not dry up in ordinary drought years because it drew from something deeper than surface rainfall. He said they had seen a few like it in this county over the years, and that the landowners who found them usually considered themselves fortunate. The veteran thanked them and watched the white truck turn back down the county road until the dust settled behind it. He stood in the field for a long time after that. The geese moved around him without concern, the way they always did, the way animals move around a person they have decided belongs to the same ground they do. The mother settled in the grass not far from his boots. The young ones grazed in their loose circle. The afternoon light came flat and gold across the dry land the way it always did that time of year, making everything look quieter and older and more permanent than it had any right to feel. He thought about the back road, the broken crate, the heat pressing down on that stretch of dust in a way that made distance look dishonest. He thought about the small voices he had heard before he had seen anything, and how he had stopped the truck before he had decided to, the way the body sometimes acts ahead of the mind when the mind is too tired to argue. He had not saved them because he expected anything in return. That was not how the lesson worked. The lesson was simpler and older than strategy. You do not leave the helpless behind. You stop. You give what you have. You carry what you can carry. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what you carried turns out to have been carrying something back. He picked up his hat from the fence post where he had set it and put it back on his head. The spring was there. The land was still his. The geese were still here. He had enough to work with. He walked back toward the barn in the long afternoon light, and the mother goose watched him go with her steady, unhurried eyes, and did not follow, because she already knew he would be back.